Mark Settle is a 7-time CIO and one of the most respected and experienced IT leaders in the industry. He is also the author of the book, From the Valley, a practical primer on the future of IT management. On this episode of IT Visionaries, Mark sits down to discuss his latest book and identifies some of the key characteristics that separate Silicon Valley startups from their peers. Enjoy this discussion. IT Visionaries is created by the team at mission.org and brought to you by the Salesforce Customer 360 platform, the #1 cloud platform for digital transformation of every experience. Build connected experience, empower every employee, and deliver continuous innovation with the customer at the center of everything you do. Learn more at salesforce.com/platform. This podcast is created by the team at mission.org.
Welcome to another episode of IT Visionaries. I'm Ian Faison, host of IT Visionaries. We are joined by multi-time guest, 7-time CIO, author, and friend of the CIO everywhere. Mark, what's going on?
Ian, it's wonderful to join you this afternoon. I've been looking forward to it.
I have been looking forward to it as well. For our listeners who don't know who Mark is, you can head back into the deep many episodes that we have in IT Visionaries lore. We did an episode with him. He's done a couple roundtables, so go check that out if you haven't. Those are great episodes. Today, we are going to dive into your new book, Truth from the Valley, a practical primer on IT management for the next decade. So let's get started. Why'd you write the book?
So during the last 3 years, I had an opportunity to work in the Valley in a startup company. And although I had worked in a variety of larger companies in the past, and I had had flirtations with the VC community here and some of the companies that they invested in as either an informal advisor or an early adopter of some of these new technologies, I had a revolutionary personal experience by actually working in such a firm. And the way IT is managed in these cloud native companies here is so completely different from the ways in which IT is conventionally managed, in a well-established, say Global 2000 or Fortune 500 company, that I really felt compelled to try to tell the story as kind of a preview of coming attractions for those CIOs that are in Atlanta and Norfolk and Chicago and, Salt Lake City. And I'm not suggesting that, some of the phenomena that we deal with here isn't being experienced by folks elsewhere. But I think the breadth of the change or the differences in the way IT is managed here in the Valley and the depth are just not really encountered in other places. So the premise of the book's pretty simple. It's based completely on a quote from a Canadian science fiction writer, a guy named William Gibson, who said, "The future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed." And so the contention is that a lot of the IT management practices that are considered commonplace and routine here in Silicon Valley, will eventually be adapted and adopted everywhere as kind of the standard way of doing business.
So this is something we have talked about many times on the show. And I want to say kind of off the top of this, yes, this podcast and team is based predominantly here in the Bay Area. Yes, our network of guests a lot of times are, quote unquote, Silicon Valley startups and things like that and technology companies. But I want to be very clear that A, we're agnostic to wherever innovation is coming from. It could come from any corner of the globe. And B, the reason why I think that it's so interesting, some of these practices that are here, is because of just how many companies that are technology companies are built here. So you just have this influx of technology people on the product side, in the marketing teams, in every part of the organization. I think that there's just a surplus of really talented people. Whereas if you just take a traditional, manufacturing company or retailer where the vast majority of the technology talent is only in the IT team, for example. So I think that there's so many different things and iterations. And then you just have so many different startups that build from scratch and have that opportunity to say, hey, we can start with cloud native. We can do all these sort of things. And the reason why I say that, we have tons of IT listeners around the globe, or CIOs or CTOs or technology leaders that listen to this show. And I think your book is the perfect salient way to say, these are the lessons from the front lines of people that are survival of the fittest, getting some really interesting lessons from the ground. So I'm excited to talk to you about it. I'm curious, like when you were researching this, what was the first thing that kind of was the aha moment for you?
That's really a great question. I guess it really was the pervasiveness of the differences. And so the book is divided up into some sections on people, process, and technology, and there's nothing original about that. Every management consultant in the world thinks about change along those dimensions. But, all too often, exactly to your point, when we talk about Silicon Valley people and we talk about cloud native company and cloud native operations, you kind of go right to some of the technology implications. But just the talent management issues alone, that exist here are going to be experienced everywhere in the US. I mean, we could quote statistics till the cows come home about how our schools are just not turning out enough people with IT backgrounds or IT experience. Somehow industry has to take on the burden of converting a bunch of music majors and philosophy majors into IT people, which, we've done in the past and we can continue to do that in the future. But the competition for talent here, is going to be experienced in a lot of markets that we don't even think about today, like Atlanta or Chicago or St. Louis. And that has incredible implications for IT leaders. Just to beat this to death a little bit, I mean, one of the implications is you have to become a brand manager. I mean, you're going to have to compete and impress people why you're the employer of choice. And if you're resting on your laurels because you've got some brand recognition, among the consumers of the world, because you're a Fortune 300 retailer or whatever, and mentality that a lot of millennials have, that's almost like a negative. You're going to have to overcome this idea that you're some big bureaucratic, lethargic organization when you're trying to pitch to somebody coming right out of Carnegie Mellon, hey, we do some really cool technology things in, XYZ company. So just to go down this road a little further, so brand management is going to become important from a recruiting point of view. Recruiting is going to be an ongoing process. Way too many IT organizations are in this, jerky motion of waiting until they get budget dollars or somebody leaves, open a rec and, try to go chase a replacement or some kind of a new skill. And I think, you can't afford to do that. You've got to have kind of a much more strategic view of the skill sets you're trying to move your organization towards, as well as the ones you're trying to get rid of. And that really is the third tenet of people management that I really spent some time on in the book, which is talent debt. So, IT people love to talk about technical debt, and they'd be the first to tell you, what hardware's in the data center that I just would love to get the heck out of there. Like, what are these applications that need to be refactored or retired altogether, et cetera. But you don't hear people talk about, oh yeah, by the way, I got a third of my staff that's all they do is maintain that old hardware and those antiquated applications. And yeah, that's not the path to the future. So anyway, I think there's huge people management concerns, and there's just not going to be enough new talent coming out. So everybody's going to walk into this box canyon and look around and try to figure out, what do I do next just to keep operations going over the long term.
Well, and we'll get into some of this stuff, but I think, we recently had Bob, the CIO of Juniper Networks, on the show, and he was talking about how, and I forget the time horizon, I want to say it's like 3 years or 4 years or whatever it was. And he was like, we will be 100% cloud native on this date. Everyone get on board. Like, if you don't want to be here, if like whatever, then, so be it. But we will do that. And they made like the giant list of things that they need to kill. And they just, picked him prod away at that, over time. And then he's like, now at the end state, it was like, man, this is great. We finally kind of made it. You take that and compare that with a startup who doesn't have to reverse engineer anything. They just start from scratch and build that way. I mean, you're talking about, I always, I love the analogy of you can get everybody on a giant cruise ship, but it's, and it has a lot of advantages, but if that cruise ship was 100 speedboats, you're going to be able to do things a lot faster. And I think it speaks to your point that you kind of discovered this because you worked at big companies as a CIO, and then you worked in startup as a CIO, and you're like, this feels really different.
Exactly right. I mean, really different. And you raise a good point there. When you've started in a cloud native world and culture and framework, you really can't appreciate, the overhang, the emotional and technical and cost overhang of a lot of legacy applications and really legacy way of doing things as well. By the same token, people that are in those older companies that have a lot of those kind of legacy processes and technologies, you can't be good at everything. Every CIO or IT leader needs to kind of look at how the state of the art of IT management has evolved here and make a calculated bet, like what do I need to get good at that'll really have a business impact in my company? And it's not all of the above. Maybe in your world, rhetorical world, security can be good enough. I mean, it doesn't need to be like some huge, highly staffed, state of the art, cool new tools, every quarter to maintain information about your supply chain or, whatever. Say you have no PII data whatsoever, you don't operate internationally, maybe security is less of a concern. And maybe in that kind of an environment, just moving to an all SaaS kind of application portfolio could be extremely leveraging long-term and provide a cool source of innovation to the company moving forward. So I think the book can be used as almost like a strategic planning guide to say, okay, here's the landscape. This is the way IT gets managed out there. What are the 3 or 4 places that I really want to place my bets as a leader of this organization? What are the skills I want to bring in? What are the technical competencies? And what are the internal processes, the way I run IT, that I kind of need to reinvent for this brave new world?
So I was talking to a Fortune 50 IT leader that we're talking about data tools because data is such a huge deal right now, obviously. And I was listing him off and he's like, to be honest, I think we use them all. He's like, I don't even know. Like, I think every one of those I'm pretty sure we use all of those. And I listed like 8 different tools, right? And it's just like, that's sort of the scope of the landscape right now. If you're that large of an organization where you're like, you have so many vendors, you have so many different ways of looking at things. And I think that they're in the middle of like trying to build out their security team and build out their like machine learning team and a few other things. But you just look at that and you're like the sprawl, and you could tell from his frustration that it's like, there's nobody, there's no plank owner on this. Nobody is actually helming any of those data decisions. And I don't think they have a CDO. But anyway, it speaks to that, like the proliferation of tools and resources and things that you can kind of just slap on and become a budget item. And like, who knows what's doing what?
Yeah, and under the new rules of engagement between IT and the business has authority and budget to go out and buy things on their own, right, and put things in place on their own. And so, I do a lot of talking about this. The days of command and control when IT was the master of the universe when it came to procuring and implementing new technology, that's a thing of the past. Now, I'm sure in many of your larger Fortune 500 companies, there still are some pretty rigid approval practices. Excuse me, and they haven't really maybe come to terms with the reality of what's going to happen next. But in the cloud native firms that we're talking about here, it's not uncommon for a company with 2,500 FTEs to maybe, be working with 800 different SaaS services of one type or another. Some big, some small, some in between. So I have a good friend over at Dropbox, Sylvie Vieux, who's the CIO there. And she coined a term in this last couple of months that I've been plagiarizing as frequently as possible. And she refers to these large collections of SaaS applications as SaaS at scale. There's a whole series of problems around managing the cost, administering these tools, and then securing the data that's moving, among these various tools as well. And, Ian brought up the case of the person that was dealing with some of the data management tools, but that problem has proliferated across the entire company.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I want to like kind of needle into some of the quote unquote Silicon Valley's way of this. And by the way, Silicon Valley is partly it's a loaded term at this point. But for the listener to think of it, it's not just the geographical region here. It's like high growth startup kind of DNA more than pure like just companies in this one geographical location. And the reason why I say that and I make that distinction is there are pros and cons to obviously the like dump money into things and do certain things. But the idea is like, even at these companies that like bloat as much as, like throw money at certain things and raise too much and do all that, they're still leaner than everybody. It's like the person who, goes to the gym every single day for 2 hours, but they also eat a bunch of McDonald's. It's like, no matter how much McDonald's they're eating, they're still way more in shape than everybody else, just because they're building from scratch on newer technology and they are just a younger company. So you have these companies, these startups that are making these decisions, and a lot of times early on without a CIO, and then a CIO comes in and can kind of just, and I mean, you could speak to your experience here, Mark, but you just kind of come in and say, all right, well, these 8 things are great, and the rest of this stuff we're going to kill, and we're going to focus on this. And you're like, I can't believe that was that easy. And I'm just curious, like when you kind of go into that type of an arena, like what are those things? What are the things that those high growth Silicon Valley companies do that can outpace their peers?
So it is a very different conversation than what I had been used to in the past. So I think a lot of standardization and rationalization initiatives that I've been associated with in bigger companies really are driven by cost considerations, and the ability to save money. And in these firms that are smaller and more progressive, and with the cost of labor, becoming so high, that if there's some kind of unique set of tools, Ian, that you and I find make us super productive, and the expense is relatively modest, does the CIO want to come in and expend some political capital taking away our video conferencing tool? And that's the problem that you have with this SaaS phenomena. There's a long tail of pretty small services that are being used by individual work groups or departments, and the cost isn't all that great on an individual basis. And the political capital that you're going to have to squander to be able to make some of these changes can be pretty high. And so, again, the concept I've been trying to advance in some recent conversations is this idea of stewardship. You don't really own everything anymore, but you do have some oversight responsibilities in terms of securing the portfolio from an information security point of view, at least understanding what the costs are and how much money is being spent and how well it's being spent in terms of utilization. Actually track kind of who's using what at the end of the day, and then proactively doing a better job of integrating these tools. And so this is another kind of revolutionary concept, at least in my mind. There are so many application teams that I've been associated with in the past where it's all about building code, right, and building new enhancements that we can shingle on top of our ERP system. In the world we live in today, there's less and less code development and more SaaS application buying. And really, all SaaS applications are just a bundle of APIs. And so really the business architecture that you're running up business operations on, really think of it more like a nest of APIs that are talking to each other. They just happen to be sitting on top of some code, right? But we got to get off this code thing all the time, because that's really not where the world is moving in the long term.
Yeah, expand on that. I mean, what are some like applications of that you've seen?
So you have major platforms like NetSuite and Salesforce and Workday, and tools like Boomi and MuleSoft. And so you use those MuleSoft and the Boomi and the Workato kind of tools to actually move data back and forth and exercise some of the logic that exists in these different platforms. I will admit to you, I've seen companies where literally some of the ops teams, they'll do an Excel spreadsheet dump out of one application, and they send that by email over to somebody else, and in the other part of the organization, they're re-entering the data manually, right? Because they just haven't set up the API connector. And this is what happens. And so each functional department will make an investment in integrating their tech stack. So, HR may be sitting on 30 different applications that do everything from recruiting to performance management to incentive planning, and you name it. And if there's benefits to them in getting that stuff integrated, they'll hire the consultants or they'll use the professional services of the vendors to make that happen. But if moving data out of their stack into marketing or finance or some other functional area would benefit the broader organization, they're supportive, but they're not going to waste their precious time and resources making that happen. In IT, we always like to talk about the only two parts of a company that really understand end-to-end operations are IT and finance. And it's time for us to put our effort where our mouth is and step up and really, go and proactively look for these integration opportunities that'll lead to more cross-functional productivity and efficiency.
So this is a great point, and I love this point because we've heard it multiple times on this show about like Atticus Tyson from Intuit was like, yeah, it's IT and finance that sees the whole company. Like where the money flows is finance, and where the tools and technologies. And I would expand that to say, if you're the type of person who says like, there's two functions of a company, there's selling stuff and making stuff, right?
Yep.
So if you're going to flow from those two pieces, like how the money travels back and forth is finance, and how those two functions of a company are optimized is through technology. And if IT owns technology, then it's like the platform in which both of those functions sit. And like, I think it's so clear to me in all of the conversations we've had on this show that the head of technology, whatever you are, the CTO, the CIO, whatever you call yourself, that is the steward for technology. If, the quote unquote, every company is going to be a technology company, or is now, and you just don't know it yet. If that is the case, and you're the head of that function, clearly you are focused on two experiences: the employee experience, how do we optimize the people who are making and servicing the product, and then the customer experience, the people who buy your things. And like, it seems so clear to me that the technology leader, and then in most companies now, what they do is they say, hey, the CTO is in charge of how the product and the technology comes to life, and then the CIO is in charge of like the employee experience. And it just seems like for the quote unquote startup, there's just so much less bureaucracy and like so much less bloat because they're just younger companies, that those two things are streamlined, and you can have that type of clarity of organizational building a lot easier. Am I wrong on that? I mean, it just seems like that's the way it's going.
So there are always nuances, right, Ian? And so one of the nuances is to some degree, you're trading one set of problems for a different set of problems. So the problems you're describing, are the bureaucratic ones of change in large organizations. Now, in smaller, faster growing organizations, you start to outgrow your processes pretty quickly. And, most of these startup companies try to sell into a small, medium-sized business market initially, and then move into larger enterprises, and everybody's competing to land customers that are like Fortune 200 customers or Fortune 100 customers, and they celebrate those kind of. Well, guess what? When you get up to servicing those kind of customers, they have global operations, multiple operating divisions, a lot of complexity, and maybe the way that you provide your customer support, or the way you do your pricing and quoting for large customers, it all changes over time. And the same way that people in a larger company would get frustrated with, boy, it's really hard to change. People in a small company get frustrated because suddenly they realize, hey, we can't like build Johnson & Johnson the same way that we build, Mark's Pharmacy in Santa Clara, over the last 2 years. I mean, these guys want an unbelievable amount of information about what they bought and who used it and when it was used. And, we've just never prepared an invoice like this before. It's unbelievable what they want. But to the big companies, that's just standard operating procedure. That's the way we do business. That's why we're going to want to see your services invoiced for us. So I think there's frustration at both ends, the chaos around constantly having to reinvent your processes and getting that right kind of tipping point. I talk about this in the book a little bit. I think everybody's familiar with the Lean Startup, the book that was published about getting to an initial value proposition. And so the author, his last name is Ries. I can't remember, Eric Ries, I think it is.
Yeah, Eric Ries. Yep.
Talks about this minimum viable product concept, something that's good enough to get people to start using it, and then you can build on that going forward. And so in the book, I plagiarized that and talked about a minimum viable process, in the sense that if you're in a big firm, you've got to prune back, all of the barnacles that have built up around all the one-time edge cases that a process encountered, to get back to something that's, satisfies 80% of the good without 100% of the bureaucracy. And if you're in a smaller company, you've got to realize that what was the minimum viable process that we had that was productive for booking an order, a year ago when we had 200 customers and they were all national is not going to work with 2,000 customers 18 months later, a third of which are operating internationally. So,
yeah, I mean, one of the physical ways that you see this manifested is like the executive briefing center, right? Yep. It's like once you get to a certain point, you build an executive briefing center, for those big deals. And it's like for a small startup, why would I ever build a building that's empty, 50% of the time, just so that, we can bring in and win big deals? Like that doesn't seem like it makes sense at all to me. But then you realize that there's a reason why people build them. It's because they work. And it helps you close these massive deals that have extreme levels of complexity. But again, where is IT involved in that kind of framework, right? Where are they involved in developing and operationalizing like processes like, hey, we need to figure out when people come to our EBC. But anyways, I digress. But the idea that like those type of things, no Silicon Valley startup, like young company is going to build an EBC. It's just not going to happen. Maybe they're going to do a minimum viable EBC as like a Zoom room, but it's not going to be something huge.
The process, I think, is a pretty common example here is so-called CPQ, configuration, pricing, and quoting. And again, we all kind of laugh about this, some of the other CIOs that I know here. You keep outgrowing that process all the time. So when people say, well, we've completed our CPQ project, everybody kind of grins because, well, maybe you've gotten something and kind of flanged together here that's going to work okay for you for the next 12 or 15 months. But guess what? You're going to be doing another CPQ. If you're successful and you're growing your business, you're going to have challenges that process just isn't going to cover. And so, sometimes people just point at the tool and say, oh, the vendor didn't really give us the capability to adapt to all these new kind of customers. But more than often, it's the internal way that the process was implemented on the vendor's tool that's got the biggest deficiencies that need to be addressed as the business gets more complex.
So what do Silicon Valley companies do wrong? What is incorrect in their approach to IT in your estimation?
Gee, that's a great question. They can wait too long to centralize. So I do believe this is based on not just my experience in one company, but talking to many other folks here. You pointed this out before. The real small company, they don't want, nor do they really need a CIO per se. They need somebody who's a VP of IT that can hand out laptops and keep the Wi-Fi network up and running. And the functional teams, they'll have operations groups that'll go out and buy the applications. And how the movie plays out. The sales guys go by Salesforce.com, and the finance guys go by NetSuite, and HR people by Workday, and more of those things, get implemented within the functional context. And then this may be self-serving, but then I think some founders are sufficiently enlightened to realize we need to centralize the use of our major platforms, like the core business platforms that we have, as a growth enabler, right? This kind of like fragmented way of doing IT business is really, it isn't maybe hamstringing the business today, but if we're going to be $1 billion company, it just can't go on like this anymore. And guess what? The functional leaders are going to have to kind of give up their little toys and tools and bring some, not all, but some of them under the umbrella of a centralized IT organization. And I don't know what the right analogy is, but you're not going to get too many popular votes like, oh yeah, let's create a centralized IT organization. Somebody has to be like enlightened with enough foresight to say that this is an enabler. And there are companies here that will go nameless in this interview, but for the right beverage, I would be more than happy to share them with you, that they've waited too long, and to get to create this concept of a centralized IT organization now would require way too much change management. Guess what? Way too much re-engineering, because people have just gotten used to this is the way that we do things here. And of course, internally, everybody, the chaos is kind of reigning, right? Because people can see where some of these deficiencies and bungled handoffs and whatnot occur, where all the gaps exist. But the leaders of the different functions feel like, well, It may be a mess, but it's my mess, and I'm not going to turn it over to settle because then I got to deal with him to get my mess cleaned up.
Yeah, that's a great point. That it's like I would just rather waste the energy, the mental energy, to just deal with it myself than have to have somebody else. Then I gotta just go to that person and they have to figure it out. Whereas I can self-diagnose pretty well. But the thing is, you might be able to self-diagnose. But you can't diagnose what marketing's doing. You can't you know what I mean? Like if you're the sales leader, you don't know what HR is doing, right? So it's like, meanwhile, the IT leader is like, you and marketing and HR and finance have the same problem, all four of you. So we need to solve the company-wide problem, and then it will in turn solve all of your problems, rather than you all trying to like put Band-Aids on something that needs a little bit more stability than that.
To be a little more constructive, I think one way of tackling that problem in a politically correct and constructive way is to think about mapping enterprise-wide data flows. So I don't know how you can possibly, disagree with the importance of doing that. Even if you own the Workday platform and I own the NetSuite platform, and if somebody said, like, what does recruit to retire really look like in this company? Like we're talking about doubling the employee population in the next 24 months. So let's really look at recruit to retire. Who gets involved? How much? All the questions that, and you might find pretty soon, it's not just an HR activity, right? Because you got an engineering function that's pouring tons of hours into filtering through different candidates and testing candidates and, trying to source new candidates from places that they've never even talked to before. But my point being is the IT function, if you come in and say, hey, you know what, I got to take over a couple of systems here and I can make hire to retired 10 times more efficient, 2 times more efficient than what it is today. That probably is not going to be a compelling argument. But if you come in with some process modelers, and some data engineers and say, hey, let's look at what happens from the moment a candidate, opens a job rec on our website to their new employee orientation session. What is that whole thing process? How many of our systems do they touch? How do we collect information about them? How are we handling PII? Do we keep them warm if they don't, if we don't have an immediate opening for them, but we're very impressed by their qualifications? And, the list of questions goes on. So I think in the stewardship model, you don't have to own it first to really kind of provide some oversight. I think one of the biggest levers you have is to show up with people who have qualifications to be able to do some of this kind of process mapping and data engineering.
So I want to say, let's give the listener, we'll say 3 takeaways that they could do right now to act more like a Silicon Valley company or to do IT management in the next decade. That was basically one, which is like map your data flows. So the first one's a freebie. You already said it, but I think that's a great idea. I love the way that you said that because it does show if you're mapping the data, it shows all the different organizations that it's going to bump into. Give me some more. What are some other practical takeaways that people, and also everyone should go read the book. We'll link it up in the show notes. Go buy the book and read it. Truth from the Valley. But give us some other nuggets.
We touched on one already, in this idea of you're as an IT leader, you're really a brand manager, for your organization when it comes to sourcing and recruiting talent. And even internally, companies, IT organizations develop reputations. And if the team is doing innovative things, has, really harmonious working relationships with the business, has a nice work-life balance, word gets out on the street. It gets out through vendors. It gets out through friends of your existing staff members that, hey, this is a pretty cool place to work for, and people kind of, they're ready to have a conversation. They'll respond to a feeler, et cetera. And then others have very different reputations, which makes the whole, recruiting process and sourcing process much more difficult. So I think leaders in particular who are more prone to having public exposure through simple things, tweets or postings on LinkedIn or maybe presentations they make at local IT meetings, et cetera. Those are all important things to do to project a brand, not manufacture one out of thin air, but to tell your story about why you are the employer of choice in your area or your industry going forward. I think that's kind of super important. So I'd stick that up there.
Something that we can implement. I want like implementation like tomorrow after listening to this episode. You got a few hours this week because of the craziness of the virus. Everybody's working from home. You don't got to commute 3 extra hours this week, and you want to make a practical thing right now, a change that can have some impact next quarter.
Okay, so here we go. This is another favorite topic that I have quite a bit of passion about that may not fit your category, what you're looking for. And that is to build a security culture. So I find this incredibly frustrating, right? So if you look at most modern companies, somewhere squirreled away in a corner of the company, there's a little information security team that's supposed to keep the other 99.9% of the employees, protected and company resources protected. And so there's this like tiny little technical team that's supposed to keep everybody out of trouble, keep us all out of trouble. You think, well, that's kind of on the surface of it, kind of crazy, but okay. Then you get into an IT organization where that little InfoSec team resides. And unfortunately, I hate to say this, but when they come out of their little cave and they try to enlist help from other members of the IT team to do simple things like, investigate an event or an alert or put a new safeguard, either a new process or a new tool into their existing process or their existing tech stack, their own colleagues in IT look at them like three-headed monsters. Like, I have got a full-time job. That's not a priority to me. That you guys need to worry about that. And all too often, people feel I'm not going to do anything until they ask me for the third time because I got other more important things to do. So my point being, many IT organizations don't even have a security culture of their own. And when you think about it, they should be the shining light of the entire corporation. People should look at IT and say we should all aspire to be as security conscious as IT is. So that's the concept. And now ways to do it, things you can do are some are pretty obvious. I mean, you need to educate your staff about what the real issues are here. One form of education that I emphasize is if you've never really been through a major breach, you really don't understand the impact that it'll have. And I've been through a few, and all your IT priorities will become immediately turned upside down in the case of a major breach. No new initiatives will be started. Existing ones will be poor boyed. Money will flow over, and there'll be lots of new tools and new people, et cetera, to try to keep everybody happy that this could never happen again. So it will affect you personally, kind of number one. Number two, and this is a simple thing.
Wait, really quick. So that's super fascinating. Do you ever do, like, as you can probably remember from your time in the military where you probably did this, but I know when I was in it, like you would practice, things happening, like a breach or something like that.
Yep.
Like, I'm so curious, like how many, companies are out there actually practicing getting breached?
There definitely like ways of doing that, right? Tabletop exercises can be conducted. You have red teaming. Actually, there's an interesting new startup that now will help take your team through kind of a red team exercise. They'll try to come through different doors and look for your vulnerabilities, et cetera. So there's definitely ways you.
But I mean like the everyday employee, because that's like the thing. And like, I'm going to ask you a question about like, coronavirus stuff in a little bit, but like it's kind of the same sort of crisis scenario where like there was everything happening a certain way. And then as soon as that happens, life completely changes and no one is prepared for it. Right. And it's like that level of emergency preparedness is just not really, of any organizations that I talk to, for the everyday employee is not really that big of a priority. So I'm like, how do you make the everyday employee feel some level of emergency preparedness that we would be prepared for in case of such an event to happen?
So again, I'm really kind of focusing my remarks on the other IT employees, because again, I think they should be exhibiting behaviors that the rest.
Oh yeah, good point.
The rest of the company should emulate. But you started this conversation, or this part of the conversation about like, what's the one thing that you can do when you go back to work or whatever. So I'm going to give your listeners a very simple one that anybody can do, and it doesn't require spending money. So I worked with a gentleman once several years ago, and one of the sayings that he had that has stuck with me, he said, anything that interests my boss fascinates me. And so if, as an IT leader, you simply show interest in security concerns and issues. I mean, I think people don't really understand how influential their behavior is, both on colleagues as well as team members and people they supervise. And very simple questions that just show that that's a top of mind issue for you. Like, doing it this way, would that somehow get to this PII database, or would the auditors, is this going to be something that would be auditable by the auditors, to make sure that if you just do some gentle probing, just try like 3 remarks a week, if you're a leader, just set up a scorecard, you'd be surprised, right? Because suddenly, like, your direct reports, if you're asking 3 and you got 3 direct reports, they're probably asking 10 collectively, and they're 10, it just communicates to the whole organization. So I think that's important. And then the other thing you can do in the short order, and this is going to sound a little draconian, but one of the problems I think we have with establishing a security culture, there really aren't consequences for doing stupid things for the most part. What you really need to have are a significant and public and well-defined set of penalties that occur when people mishandle, sensitive, confidential, intellectual property, PII data, et cetera. And I'm not saying, you fire people, but you'd like to believe that with human nature, you can just explain to people what they need to do and why they need to do it. But anybody that has a teenage kid knows that there has to be some kind of consequences when people don't follow the rules. And I think all too often, companies don't have those kind of preordained penalties. And so consequently, when you don't see any action being taken when things go wrong, or clear guidelines are being kind of flaunted, then everybody says to themselves, well, they didn't really mean it after all. So, it's really not important.
Yeah, that's a great one. We see the rise of zero trust as a framework. And I think that, I feel like I see trust but verify more often on like LinkedIn and stuff now than I ever have before. But I think that that's a great point, that it's like there do have to be consequences for certain things, and people need to understand. I always thought that, one of the powerful things of, and I don't know who said this, but, you need to have examples of what like right looks like, and like what makes a hero in your organization. Like, oh, this person, coded for 12 hours straight and, did and made something amazing. Well, it's like, well, if you make that person a hero, then being a hero means that you code for 12 hours straight. So like, you kind of need to figure out, is that something that we want people to do? What makes someone a hero is super important, but it also, by the same token, is like what makes someone a villain, and makes, and making sure that people understand what that was. I always tell the story of the like senior leader that plugged their iPhone into a secret computer when I was in Afghanistan, and the security guy blowtorched it in front of the entire brigade leadership team. Like, that's not a good feeling to have your iPhone blowtorched in front of the entire leadership team.
I like that. I'm going to tell you a story. We're out kind of down this road. I'll tell you a story you might find entertaining. This is many years ago. I was working in a company where we had a number of government contracts, and we had purchased equipment using government money, taxpayer money. And as a consequence, we could be audited spontaneously at any time. Under the kind of contracts that we had, government auditors could come in and pretty much look at any aspect of our operations. And we had many people that were misusing IT equipment to gamble and view pornography and just kind of all the things, gaming, things they should not have been doing. And the senior staff, we begged and pleaded with people to stop this. And the whole contract would have been in jeopardy if we had been audited and some of this behavior had been discovered. And it went on for several weeks, and we finally fired one of the culprits. And the level of activity went to near zero after this one individual was fired. Because although we had gone out and begged people to stop misusing these taxpayer-paid resources, they didn't see any consequence to their misbehavior, and so they all blithely went on and continued doing what they were doing. And it just took that one, termination to get the point across, like, no, we mean this. Like, this does have a consequence. And the whole phenomenon almost disappeared overnight. It was a remarkable kind of exercise in human behavior. I learned a lot through that experience.
Yeah, people definitely, an example is you could send 100 memos, but the one example of the blowtorch is going to get through,
Yeah.
or the termination. More than 100, you could put the flyers on every computer. You can have stickers on every laptop. You can do all of those things, but at the end of the day, that's not going to be as memorable. Okay, so before we get out of here, two more questions. So obviously the coronavirus has changed the world in a matter of weeks. Pretty much. I mean, the entire Bay Area is on work from home status. It's a sad time. It's crazy. I think people, there's cause for obviously a lot of alarm. There's also cause for a lot of optimism that, things will get better, and there's a lot of smart people working on it. From a business standpoint, as someone who's been a CIO 7 times, I'm curious, like, what would be your message to the team in a time of crisis like this? Like, what would be the things that you would want to make sure to tell not only just like your IT organization, but the company broadly about, how to deal with this new working environment?
That is a really great question. So I think the message to the team has to be a pretty clear statement of priorities, because whatever we were working on before, whatever that list of priorities was before, has to have changed in some fashion or another. And, frankly, a lot of the aspects of IT operations that have to do with supporting end users are pretty much taken for granted and, supported by a fairly small team of people. And in this kind of a situation with the massive move towards working from home, their activities and responsibilities are of paramount importance, right? So just as a kind of productivity enabler for this whole new population of people that have been sent home, their knowledge is incredibly important, even to the point of where maybe you start moving some resources internally around and try to put some people onto the service desk that have never worked with service desk before, just because there's going to be a kind of an avalanche of issues that have to get sorted out there. So I think, that's one message. And I think really you want to echo that to the whole company that, obviously we're a service organization. The number one job right now is to, make sure that we don't miss a beat and just maintaining existing operations. And if we have some major initiatives that were designed to make things better, well, they were to make things better in like a world that we felt confident at forecasting and projecting. And now we're less confident we can do that. And I've talked to, peers at other companies, and universally, I think a lot of things have been paused or put on hold in that regard. A lot of the plans, all companies go through October to December strategic planning exercise to kind of line up initiatives and get their budget sorted out for the next year. And I've talked to many people who said that was really useful. Well, it had tremendous benefit because we asked ourselves a bunch of what if questions, and it was great for teamwork. But now we've pretty much torn all that stuff up, and we're kind of replanning the year. So anyway, that's maybe the long-term observation. The other thing I wanted to add about this is I think there's a immediate knee-jerk reaction to boost communication, which is a good thing, but it can be carried to an extreme. And I have kind of a developing concern that if there's way too much over-communication, I guess over-communication initially is good, but if you start to do this week after week after week, you're using up a lot of time that people use to get their jobs done. And I've talked to some people already who said, I'm working harder now than I ever did because my Zoom calls start, at 8:30 or 8 in the morning. They pretty much go on till 4 to 5 in the afternoon. And then I'm like, have homework to do. I have stuff, I'm responsible, stuff I have to write, emails I have to respond to, presentations that I need to review or construct from scratch. Like I'm staying up hours after dinner trying to get the work done that I normally would have done in the office. And so, maybe the shock value of what's happened necessitates an overabundance of communication initially. But I think people are going to have to discover the right balance and really give some time back to people, because I'm really not sure that these long work days are a sustainable kind of way of doing business.
Oh, they're definitely not. They're definitely not sustainable doing business or sustainable for our psyche. But the funny thing is The old way isn't really sustainable either, right? Like I'm going to commute an hour each way or more for certain, people throughout the country and, fight with traffic and, do all that other stuff. Like that way isn't necessarily sustainable either. I think that it's really important for leaders to find balance and figure out how to allow their teams, to your point, to have deep work time. And this is just no matter how you work. And then I think you need to have time for the water cooler BS time, like to hang out with your colleagues and like be people that talk about life beyond just the specific work things. And I think being intentional about that stuff. The other thing that we've talked about a little bit on some of our other podcasts is this idea of like kind of planning your vacation, that at some point this will end, and when it does, there is going to be this natural kind of like, global release of like happiness and all that sort of stuff. And it can be fun to plan what that looks like for your team and to plan how you want to do something fun with everyone, or whether it's change how you do your customer conference a little bit, or, whatever that thing is. I think as someone who, spent a year in Afghanistan planning vacations for when I got out. I can tell you it is a little therapeutic to plan the things that you're going to do when you kind of return to a more normal life. And the other piece of that might be just giving people extra time to spend with their families, to go, explore the world or do other things. So I think that just being purposeful and thoughtful about how you are doing that communication, and not over communicating, like you said, from a standpoint of taking people's time back, but just focusing on like, checking in with individual people's one-on-ones and saying like, hey, let's do some stuff that actually is fun and exciting and plan for the future, because there will be a future.
It's a good point. This is a real test of the kind of relationship that you have with your team members if you're a leader, because if there's a lot of trust there, you don't need a lot of time, right? I mean, I can call you up and say, hey, Ian, you good? I'm good. We don't need to spend a whole lot more time than that. Now, if you have a much more formal and distant relationship, with your boss, if that same conversation could strike fear and terror into their hearts in terms of their job security. Like, this guy just calls me, I have like a 2-minute touch base conversation that's not satisfying to me at all. And I'm not feeling really like getting a warm fuzzy here about my importance in the group and, the role I'm going to play in the future. So I think it's a huge test of existing relationships. And then I think the other thing leaders need to do, you need to be pretty sensitive to the personalities of your team members. I've heard the current situation referred to as the holiday for introverts, because all the distractions that they hate at work, like, are suddenly, kind of dissolved. And, even if they're on a Zoom call, they can sit there and, mute out their video feed and bang away on their machines. So those people need probably to get through to them. You're going to need to put a little spin on the way you interact and the way you message.
I think it's a logical ending point for this episode, because a lot of the, remote only companies, and some of those, startups that allow people to work from home multiple days a week, or, hey, I pick up my kids Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So, I need to stop work at 2 and then, do whatever it is, figured out some of that stuff, not all, but a lot of them did. And so, a little bit more truth from the valley there. I thank everyone for listening. Go check out the book. By the way, as we're talking here, I have your book, Truth from the Valley, a practical primer on future IT management trends, up on my computer. And one of the books that it recommends is at the bottom of Amazon, a book that says, is your boss an idiot, or something like that. And I was laughing at us talking about trying to be a good boss and Amazon recommending a book. Like, wait a second here. But everyone check out the book. Mark, thanks for coming on. Well, final question here. This is our abbreviated lightning round. Thanks to Salesforce and salesforce.com/platform. Go check it out. What's your favorite animal?
Dog.
They're the best.
They're the best.
That's it. Mark, any final thoughts?
Today is National Puppy Day. There's a final thought.
There you go. Awesome. All right. Talk soon.
Okay. Take care.
IT Visionaries is created by the team at mission.org and brought to you by the Salesforce Customer 360 platform, the #1 cloud platform for digital transformation of every experience. Build connected experience, empower every employee, and deliver continuous innovation with the customer at the center of everything you do. Learn more at salesforce.com/platform.